In 1970, in the manufacturing complex of Rochester, New York, the Eastman Kodak Company executed an industrial miracle. They were not grinding precision glass. They were stamping out plastic. By that year's end, Kodak had sold over 50 million units of a single, rigid camera design. The retail price was under $16. It had no focus ring, no light meter, and a rudimentary shutter. To professionals, this machine barely qualified as a camera. Yet, this cheap box held an absolute monopoly on the visual record of the American middle class. It asked nothing of the user, finding its way into glove compartments and suburban birthday parties across the continent. But the camera was a trap. It was practically worthless without the proprietary 126 film cartridge, a closed format only Kodak controlled. When that chemical supply was eventually abandoned, 50 million cameras turned instantly into unfixable dead plastic. The camera still worked. The market no longer wanted what it represented. But the real story of the Kodak Instamatic is not the story of a plastic box that lost its film. It is the story of how an optical empire built a perfect system to capture American memory, and what happened when that system became a cage. Every week we tell the stories of the cameras, lenses, films, factories, stores, labs, and repair benches that once taught people how to see, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In a quiet, climate-controlled engineering room in Rochester, New York, in 1959. By the late 1950s, photography was a mass medium in America, but it was not a frictionless one. The Eastman Kodak Company controlled the global film market, generating massive, reliable profits from its iconic yellow boxes of Kodacolor and Kodachrome. But the company's executives, analyzing sales data in Rochester, recognized a persistent, quiet crisis at the consumer level. The crisis had nothing to do with image quality, optical sharpness, or the science of color dyes. The crisis was rooted in the simple, physical act of loading a camera. For decades, amateur photography relied on roll film. Formats like 120 or 620 required the user to break a fragile paper seal, pull a delicate paper leader across the open back of the camera, thread the tapered tip into a narrow take-up spool, and manually wind the mechanical transport knob while carefully watching a small red window on the back of the camera to align the first printed frame number. This process was terrifying to the average consumer. If the photographer's hands trembled, if they were standing in bright sunlight, or if they failed to thread the spool tightly enough, the film roll would loosen on the spool. Light would leak past the backing paper, instantly fogging the light-sensitive emulsion. The roll would be completely ruined before a single picture was ever taken. In camera stores across America, from independent Main Street dealers to the photography counters of large department stores, the most common request heard by clerks was not for technical advice on aperture settings or lens resolution. It was a plea for mechanical help. Customers would walk in, purchase a yellow box of film, hand it directly to the dealer across the glass counter, and ask the clerk to load the camera. When the roll was finished, they would return, afraid to open the camera back, and ask the store owner to unload it. Kodak realized that every ruined roll, every intimidated customer, and every camera left sitting in a hall closet because it was too difficult to operate represented a lost chemical sale. The barrier to entry was entirely physical. The company's engineers, operating under a highly secretive initiative known internally as Project 13, were tasked with designing a system that was completely foolproof. Led by designer Hubert Nerwin, a man who had previously engineered precision equipment for Zeiss Ikon in Germany, the team understood that they could not simply build a better camera body. They needed to build a better container. They needed to remove the threading, the spooling, the backing paper tension, and the user's fear entirely. The engineering solution was an asymmetrical, rigid plastic cassette. The unexposed film and the take-up spool were sealed in one continuous unit. There was no paper leader to pull. There was no empty spool to align. Because the cartridge had a thick side and a thin side, it could only be inserted into the camera one way. It was physically impossible to load it backward. In the spring of 1963, Kodak unveiled the result to the global market. They called the camera the Instamatic. The film format it consumed was designated as 126. The launch was a massive, highly orchestrated consumer event. The camera body was small, rectangular, and utterly unpretentious. The user simply opened the hinged back of the Instamatic, dropped the plastic 126 cartridge into the chamber, closed the door, and wound the thumb lever until it physically locked. The camera was loaded in 3 seconds, in broad daylight, with zero risk of fogging the emulsion. The baseline domestic model, the Instamatic 50, was priced at an astonishingly accessible $15.95. At that retail price, a camera was no longer a major household investment meant to be protected in a padded leather case. It was an impulse buy. It was a gift for a 10-year-old. It was an extra item tossed into a shopping cart before a family road trip to the Grand Canyon. The established photographic press, including magazines like Modern Photography and Popular Photography, largely dismissed the plastic box. To professional reviewers, the Instamatic barely registered as an optical instrument. The lens, the glass or plastic system that bends light onto the film plane, was rudimentary. It featured a fixed focus, meaning everything from roughly 4 feet to infinity was acceptably clear, but nothing was ever surgically sharp. It had a fixed aperture, usually around f11, limiting the amount of light that could enter, and a fixed mechanical shutter speed of roughly 1/90th of a second. This specific mathematical combination was chosen because on a sunny day with ASA 64 color film, it would produce an acceptable exposure without the user needing to measure or understand the light. But Kodak did not care about the professional verdict or the magazine reviews. The executives in Rochester cared about volume. The Instamatic was the ultimate execution of the classic razor and blades economic model, deployed with global efficiency. The $15.95 camera was merely the delivery mechanism. The real product, the engine that printed money for the Eastman Kodak Company, was the continuous, unbroken cycle of 126 film cartridges moving from the factory to the camera, to the processing lab, and back to the consumer. The physical machine solved the counter-loading crisis overnight. It bypassed the camera store clerk entirely. It allowed the product to escape the specialized photography store and enter pharmacies, supermarkets, and gas stations. The camera had found its market. The market had not yet revealed its full price. To understand why the Instamatic locked into American culture so completely, one must look at the physical object itself and how it operated in the hands of an untrained, hurried user. The original Instamatic 50 solved the loading crisis, but it was practically blind indoors. In the early 1960s, the typical American home was too dark for ASA 64 color film to record an image without a massive injection of artificial light. For decades, amateur indoor photography had been a halting, dangerous, and disruptive process. It required the user to physically insert single-use glass flash bulbs into a large, highly polished metal reflector mounted on the camera bracket. The photographer would frame the shot, tell the family to hold still, and press the shutter. The bulb would fire, melting its internal magnesium wire in a blinding, instantaneous burst of light. Then, the photographer had to physically remove the spent bulb, often while the thin glass was still searing hot, occasionally burning their fingers, before a fresh, unused bulb could be carefully inserted for the next picture. It was a slow, painful rhythm that destroyed the spontaneity of a child's birthday party or a chaotic Christmas morning. The true leap in convenience, the invention that cemented the Kodak Instamatic's dominance in indoor photography, arrived in 1965. Eastman Kodak, working in a highly successful engineering partnership with Sylvania Electric Products, introduced the Flash Cube. The Flash Cube changed the physical rhythm of the American living room. It was not simply a new type of bulb. It was a small, transparent plastic block containing 4 distinct miniature flash bulbs, each permanently positioned in front of its own tiny, integrated mirrored reflector. The entire cube mounted directly onto a specialized rotating socket on the top of newer Instamatic models, like the immensely popular Instamatic 104. When the user pressed the shutter button, the camera fired the forward-facing bulb. As the user wound the thumb lever to advance the film for the next shot, a mechanical linkage inside the camera physically rotated the flash cube exactly 90 degrees, bringing a fresh, unburned bulb into the forward position. 4 shots, 4 flashes, rapid succession. The user never had to touch hot glass. When all 4 bulbs were burned out, the cube was simply pulled off the socket and thrown in the trash. The physical sensation of using an Instamatic was entirely different from operating a traditional mechanical camera. A Leica rangefinder or a Nikon single-lens reflex demanded calculation. They required the user to think about light as a variable that had to be measured, controlled, and compensated for. The Instamatic offered only a hollow plastic click, the ratcheting whir of the advance wheel, and the sharp, startling pop of the Sylvania Flash Cube. Rivals could not easily copy this ecosystem. The genius of the 126 format was that Kodak owned the patents on both the cartridge design and the film transport mechanism. The 126 film itself was pre-exposed with frame numbers and a continuous black border, and it featured a single registration hole per frame. A physical metal pin inside the Instamatic camera would drop into this hole, locking the film perfectly in place for the exposure. The German photographic giant Agfa realized the danger of Kodak's monopoly immediately. In response, Agfa attempted to launch its own rapid loading system called Agfa Rapid, using standard 35mm film pushed from one cassette to another. But the Agfa system was inherently more complex, slightly more prone to jamming, and lacked the sheer, overwhelming marketing power of Rochester. It failed to gain meaningful traction in America. Eventually, the entire global camera industry had to surrender. Japanese engineering powerhouses, companies like Minolta and Yashica, that prided themselves on precision optical instruments, were forced to manufacture their own cheap cameras that accepted Kodak's 126 film just to survive in the lucrative consumer space. But this was a trap. Every time Minolta sold a 126 camera, they were inadvertently locking their own customer into buying Kodak chemistry and Kodak patented cartridges for the rest of that machine's operational life. By the late 1960s, this closed system had fundamentally altered the retail landscape of photography. Historically, cameras and film were sold in specialized camera stores. These were spaces dominated by glass counters, imported lenses, darkroom chemicals, and highly knowledgeable clerks. But because the 126 cartridge required absolutely zero technical explanation to load, and the Flash Cube required zero explanation to use, the Instamatic did not need a specialized salesman. It could be sold anywhere by anyone. The yellow boxes began appearing on end caps in Kmart department stores. They were stacked near the cash registers in neighborhood Rexall pharmacies. They were listed prominently in the thick, mail-order catalogs of Sears, Roebuck and Company, bringing the camera to rural routes miles away from any dedicated photography shop. They were sold in grocery stores, hardware shops, and even gas stations along interstate highways. The camera became democratized to the point of invisibility. The magazines, like Popular Photography, still largely ignored it in favor of reviewing complex European and Japanese metal cameras. But the American public bought the plastic box by the millions. You did not need to know what an aperture was, the adjustable opening in a lens that controls how much light enters. You did not need to understand shutter speed. The baseline Instamatic had a fixed aperture, usually around f11, and a fixed shutter speed of roughly 1/99th of a second. This specific mathematical combination was not an accident. It was chosen because on a sunny day with Kodak's standard ASA64 color film, it would produce an acceptable exposure. If it was cloudy, the picture was slightly dark. If you were indoors, you simply attached a flash cube. The system was rigid, lacking all creative control, but it was relentlessly, mechanically reliable. And reliability, for a mother trying to photograph her child's first steps before the moment passed, was far more valuable than optical perfection. The Instamatic solved the mechanical problem of loading a camera, but in doing so, it created a new, massive industrial demand for processing. By 1970, the Kodak Instamatic was no longer just a successful product line. It was the default mechanical engine of American memory. In less than a decade, the Eastman Kodak Company had manufactured and sold more than 50 million Instamatic cameras. The sheer scale of this industrial output was unprecedented in the history of optical engineering. The company's dominance was so absolute, and the yellow boxes of 126 films so pervasive that the system bordered on a public utility, functioning in the background of American life much like electricity or water. The physical presence of the plastic camera was inescapable. It was hanging from the wrists of tourists standing in front of Cinderella Castle at Disneyland. It was sitting on wooden picnic tables in Yellowstone National Park. It was tucked into the rucksacks of American soldiers stationed overseas. It was the primary tool used by teenagers, grandparents, and mothers who had never previously owned a camera. This staggering volume of film consumption required a completely new architectural and retail infrastructure to support it. The Instamatic had successfully removed the friction of loading the camera, but Kodak understood that the customer still faced the friction of processing the film. Dropping a roll-off at a camera store and waiting a week for the prints to return from a distant lab was a bottleneck in the chemical pipeline. To solve this, the era birthed a new phenomenon specifically designed to feed the 126 Instamatic ecosystem, the Photomat kiosk. Founded in San Diego in 1967, Photomat rapidly expanded into a nationwide chain of tiny, drive-through film processing booths. They featured a highly distinctive, brightly painted yellow pyramidal roof. These isolated structures began appearing in the vast asphalt parking lots of American shopping centers, anchored right outside the glass doors of retail giants like Kmart, Woolworths, and J.C. Penney. The physical premise of the Photomat kiosk was revolutionary in its reduction of human friction. A driver did not even need to turn off their car's engine, unbuckle their seatbelt, or open their door. They simply pulled their Chevrolet or Ford up to the sliding glass window, handed their exposed, rigid plastic 126 cartridge to the attendant inside the booth, received a paper receipt, and drove away. Behind the scenes, the Photomat system was a relentless industrial loop. A fleet of couriers would drive from kiosk to kiosk, collecting thousands of exposed 126 cartridges. They transported the film to massive, centralized photo finishing plants that ran 24 hours a day, utilizing massive automated machines that stripped the film from the plastic cassettes, ran it through long baths of chemical developer, and exposed the negatives onto continuous rolls of photographic paper. The finished prints were cut, packaged, and returned to the kiosk by the very next afternoon. When the customer drove back through the parking lot, they were handed a distinct paper envelope filled with square, 3.5-inch color prints and the processed negative strips. The Photomat kiosk and the Instamatic camera were perfectly symbiotic. The cheap plastic camera generated an endless, unyielding demand for chemical processing. The drive-through kiosk reduced the friction of fulfilling that demand to almost zero. At its absolute peak, Photomat operated over 4,000 individual kiosks across the United States. The specialized photography stores, the shops with the glass counters, and the Leica rangefinders were bypassed entirely. The Instamatic did not belong to the professional photographer. It belonged to the American suburb. Consider a typical suburban birthday party in 1972. A father stands in a crowded, wood-paneled living room holding a basic Instamatic 104. He does not spend time adjusting a focusing ring on the lens. He does not check a handheld selenium light meter to read the exposure values of the room. The room is chaotic. Children are moving. The moment is fleeting. He raises the lightweight plastic box to his eye, centers his daughter in the bright, highly simplified optical viewfinder, and presses the plastic shutter button. The mechanical linkage fires. The Sylvania flash cube ignites, casting a harsh, flat, brilliant white light across the room, freezing the moment in a fraction of a second against the rapidly falling off background darkness. He winds the thumb wheel. The cube spins exactly 90 degrees. He is ready for the next frame in less than 2 seconds. If this camera disappeared, America would not simply lose another cheap, mass-produced consumer product. It would lose the frictionless mechanical process that allowed ordinary, untrained people to prove their families existed. In that moment, the camera was not a luxury object. It was the difference between a photograph that existed and a moment that disappeared forever. The physical images produced by this closed system were aesthetically distinct, shaped entirely by the mechanical constraints of the cartridge. Because the 126 negative was perfectly square, measuring exactly 28 millimeters by 28 millimeters, complete with a continuous pre-exposed black border, the resulting paper prints returned from the Photomat lab were always square. They rarely possessed the razor-sharp resolution of a 35 millimeter negative shot through a Japanese glass lens. They often featured slightly soft edges due to the limitations of Kodak's single-element plastic meniscus lenses. They exhibited a characteristic darkening vignette in the corners where the light failed to reach the edges of the frame. But paired with the vibrant, highly saturated chemical dyes of Kodak's proprietary Kodacolor X emulsion, these technical imperfections did not ruin the photographs. Instead, they became the definitive aesthetic signature of an entire era. The slightly soft focus, the occasionally muddy shadows, and the harsh, direct blast of the flash cube became the absolute visual language of the 1970s American Family album. Kodak's confidence in the 126 format grew so absolute that they briefly attempted to push the cartridge into higher-tier professional markets, entirely misunderstanding why the format was successful in the first place. They released the Kodak Instamatic Reflex, an expensive, highly complex single-lens reflex camera manufactured in Germany. It featured a precision contour electronic shutter and accepted high-end interchangeable lenses crafted by Schneider Kreuznach. A photographer could theoretically mount a world-class, critically sharp German optical lens onto a camera that consumed drop-in 126 plastic cartridges. But the Instamatic Reflex was an evolutionary dead end. Serious photographers, the readers of modern photography, did not want to be trapped in Kodak's proprietary, pre-framed cartridge system. They wanted the flexibility, the film flatness, and the emulsion variety of standard 35mm roll film. They wanted to choose their own developers. They did not want a plastic cartridge dictating their workflow. The failure of the high-end Instamatics only proved a larger point. The core strength of the empire remained firmly anchored to the cheap, mass-market plastic models sold on the end caps of Sears and Kmart. The strength was not optical perfection. The strength was volume, ubiquity, and the relentless sale of chemistry. By the mid-1970s, the Kodak Instamatic was the undisputed, unassailable king of the American snapshot. The system was complete, closed, and highly profitable. The brand looked strongest at the exact moment its weakness became structural. How does Layer 5 look? The word count is roughly 1,400 words across both parts. It includes the required 6 to 10 named entities, the deep physical descriptions, the midpoint stakes scene, and ends precisely on the doorway sentence. The long decline of the Instamatic empire did not begin with a dramatic filing for bankruptcy in a federal court. It did not begin with a sudden, devastating factory strike or an unexpected padlock on the gates of Kodak Park in Rochester. It began, as deep technological shifts almost always do, with a quiet concession to consumer convenience and a profound miscalculation of chemical quality. The first small crack in the foundation appeared in 1972, and it was engineered entirely by Kodak itself. Seeking to make amateur photography even more effortless and portable, the company introduced the Pocket Instamatic line. This new system utilized a heavily miniaturized film format designated as 110. The 110 cartridge, a tiny, double-chambered plastic cassette containing the film and take-up spool, functioned exactly like the older 126 system. It offered drop-in loading with zero threading and zero danger of sunlight fogging the emulsion. The cameras themselves were long, incredibly slender, and could easily slip into a formal shirt pocket or a small handbag. The American consumer market, primed by a decade of Instamatic marketing, gravitated toward the new form factor immediately. Within days of its release, the original boxy 126 Instamatic cameras sitting on drugstore shelves across the country suddenly looked ancient. They looked heavy. They looked like yesterday's industrial design. But the success of the 110 format was an illusion that hid a structural flaw. The 110 negative, the physical piece of chemically coated plastic that records the light image, was minuscule, measuring just 13 millimeters by 17 millimeters. This was less than half the surface area of the already modest 126 square format. When regional photo finishing labs and drive-through photomat kiosks attempted to enlarge these tiny 110 negatives onto standard 3.5-inch paper prints, the physics of optics revolted. The resulting photographs were routinely plagued by heavy, intrusive grain, a severe loss of edge resolution, and muddy, washed-out color tones. The American consumer loved the physical convenience of carrying a pocket-sized camera to a graduation or a backyard barbecue. But when they opened their paper print envelopes a day later, they were quietly, persistently building an unspoken dissatisfaction with the quality of the image. The first crack was not a failure to sell hardware. It was a slow, invisible erosion of consumer confidence in the final print. And while Kodak was busy cannibalizing its highly profitable 126 market with the optically inferior 110 pocket system, a far more dangerous systemic threat was quietly organizing across the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese camera industry, led by engineering powerhouses like Canon, Nikon, Minolta, and Olympus, had spent the previous 2 decades completely conquering the global professional and advanced amateur markets with their precision 35mm single-lens reflex cameras. They had established an unassailable reputation for optical glass engineering and mechanical longevity. But in the late 1970s, as the global economy tightened, these manufacturers collectively turned their industrial attention away from the exclusive studio and toward the mass consumer. The primary force that would eventually dismantle the Instamatic empire was not the invention of digital photography. It was Force 5, technology displacement. Driven entirely by the mechanical automation of standard 35mm film. Historically, 35mm film had been the exclusive domain of the serious hobbyist because it required the exact same manual dexterity, patience, and visual attention that Kodak had spent 30 years trying to eliminate. Loading a standard 35mm metal canister required pulling a film leader, slotting it into an internal axle, checking the gear teeth, and closing the camera door with a prayer that the advanced mechanism wouldn't strip the perforations. But in the late 1970s, Japanese electronics engineers began introducing a new breed of highly compact 35mm point-and-shoot cameras, equipped with internal microprocessors and motorized auto-loading systems. Motorized auto-loading, a mechanical system where a miniature electric motor automatically catches the film leader and winds it to the first frame the moment the camera back is closed, instantly bypassed the primary competitive advantage that the 126 cartridge had held exclusively for 15 years. Suddenly, a consumer did not have to choose between the absolute simplicity of a plastic Kodak cartridge and the professional image quality of a full-frame 35mm negative. The Japanese compact cameras offered both. This technological leap was weaponized by the introduction of automated exposure and, most critically, electronic autofocus. Autofocus, a system that utilizes infrared beams or contrast detection to mechanically move the lens elements until the subject is perfectly sharp without the human hand ever touching a focusing ring, changed the entire vocabulary of the camera store counter. In 1977, Konica introduced the breakthrough C35AF, the world's first mass-produced autofocus camera. It was quickly followed by the iconic Canon SureShot series. A retail clerk working the photography section of a Sears or a local department store no longer had to spend 20 minutes explaining the physics of zone focusing, depth of field, or manual exposure calculations to a hesitant buyer. The salesman could simply pick up a Japanese 35mm compact, hand it across the glass counter to a mother or a father, and tell them to look through the clear glass viewfinder. The camera did everything. It measured the light, it set the internal shutter speed, it focused the glass lens, and it wound the film with a sharp, confident electric whir. The primitive, fixed-focus plastic lens of the Kodak Instamatic, which had relied on the user standing exactly 4 to 10 feet away in bright sunlight to achieve an acceptably sharp image, was rendered obsolete almost overnight. Concurrently, Force 1. Price compression began to squeeze the margins of the Rochester system. As Japanese manufacturing scaled up, the retail prices of these highly automated 35mm cameras dropped rapidly into the consumer sweet spot. By the early 1980s, an amateur photographer could purchase a precision-engineered automated compact camera that produced razor-sharp pictures for a price that made the cheap, non-adjustable plastic Instamatic look like an expensive toy. The market was turning, and the closed loop that Kodak had constructed to trap its users was about to tighten into a noose. As the Japanese 35mm automated compacts flooded the American market, the retail landscape began to violently realign its loyalties. By the mid-1980s, a camera store clerk, a Kmart department manager, and the purchasing directors at the Sears, Roebuck & Company catalog all looked at the same profit margins. The 126 Instamatic had become a low-margin commodity. The physical shelf space in pharmacies and camera shops, the highly valuable eye-level glass displays that once featured rows of brightly colored Kodak boxes, was quietly handed over to Canon, Nikon, and Olympus. The Instamatic was pushed to the bottom shelf. Then, it was pushed to the back of the store. The catalog did not announce the decline with a press release. It simply gave the Kodak plastic product less space. But the fatal blow to the 126 empire was not dealt at the retail camera counter. It was dealt at the processing lab. For 20 years, the Instamatic had relied on the massive, centralized infrastructure of overnight photo finishing, championed by the thousands of drive-through photomat kiosks in parking lots across America. But in the 1980s, Force 7, cultural habit collapse, completely dismantled that infrastructure. The American consumer no longer wanted to wait 24 hours to see their memories. They wanted them immediately. This demand was met by the invention of the 1-hour mini lab, a massive, self-contained, computerized chemical processing machine manufactured by companies like Noritsu and Fuji. These mini labs were installed directly inside local supermarkets, drugstores, and shopping malls. The 1-hour mini lab was an industrial marvel, but it was rigorously optimized for standard 35mm film. When a lab technician processed a roll of 35mm, the machine automatically pulled the continuous strip of negatives through the chemical baths, scanned the frames, and projected the images onto a fast-moving roll of light-sensitive paper. The 126 format broke this automated rhythm. While the chemical developer for 126 was exactly the same as 35mm, the standard C41 color process, the physical dimensions of the film were entirely different. The 126 negative was square, not rectangular. In order to print an Instamatic cartridge, the lab technician had to physically stop the mini lab. They had to manually remove the 35mm negative carrier, insert a specialized 28mm square metal mask, recalibrate the optical crop, and adjust the paper advance. When a drugstore photo counter was backed up with a queue of 50 rolls of 35mm film from a weekend soccer tournament, the technician was deeply reluctant to halt the machine just to accommodate a single 126 Instamatic cartridge. Slowly, local labs began to refuse 126 film. They did not ban it outright, but they instituted a penalty of friction. If a customer dropped off a 126 cartridge at a local pharmacy, they were told it could not be done in an hour. It had to be sent out to an external facility. The turnaround time stretched from 1 hour to 3 days, and then to a week. The 1-hour promise was broken. The old camera did not become useless. It became deeply inconvenient. As the processing friction increased, the iconic yellow photomat kiosks began to shut down. The drive-through booths were abandoned, their sliding windows boarded up, left to slowly rust in the corners of suburban parking lots as the market moved its film processing indoors. The vast symbiotic network that had supported 50 million Instamatics collapsed under the weight of 35mm automation. Kodak officially ceased manufacturing the 126 Instamatic camera line in 1988. But the hardware was never the true heart of the empire. The cameras were solid state, containing no delicate microprocessors to fry and no complex metal gear trains to jam. They were sealed with heavy plastic snap tabs. Millions of them sat in kitchen drawers, attic boxes, and hall closets, perfectly capable of opening a shutter and exposing a piece of plastic to light. Force 3 service and repair collapse did not look like a line of angry customers holding broken cameras. It looked like chemical starvation. The camera survived physically, but the chemical support system around it was deliberately cut off. Over the next decade, as digital photography loomed on the horizon, Kodak aggressively trimmed its legacy film production to save costs. The 126 cartridge, which required specialized injection-molded plastic cassettes and a unique paper backing machine, became a financial burden to manufacture for a rapidly dwindling user base. The end of the empire was not an explosion. It was the quiet removal of a yellow box from a distribution manifest. The catalog changed. The dealers stopped ordering. The mini lab stopped processing. The mask was removed, the parts drawer emptied, the film expired. The rival was cheaper. The camera remained. The market moved on. Today, the Kodak Instamatic is one of the very few historically massive camera empires that exists in a state of true, absolute obsolescence. If you buy a 1950s Leica M3 rangefinder, you can load it with modern 35mm film manufactured yesterday and shoot a professional wedding tomorrow. If you buy a 1930s Rolleiflex twin-lens reflex, you can load it with modern 120-roll film, send it to a lab in any major city, and receive gallery-quality medium-format negatives. But if you find a Kodak Instamatic 104 sitting in a thrift store bin for $2, you cannot simply use it. The Eastman Kodak Company ceased the production of the 126 cartridge format entirely in 1999. A few niche European manufacturers, most notably Farania in Italy, produced small, specialized batches of 126 film under the Solaris brand name to feed the remaining cameras. But even that final lifeline was completely cut in 2007. Today, the global commercial supply of 126 film is dead. In the modern collector market, the standard plastic Instamatics hold almost zero monetary value. You can find them piled in cardboard boxes at local flea markets, or listed in lots of 10 on eBay for the price of shipping. They are not precision optical instruments. They do not possess the heavy, cold brass satisfaction of a mechanical Nikon. Furthermore, they cannot be overhauled, lubricated, or repaired. Hubert Nerwin and the engineers of Project 13 designed the camera bodies to be assembled quickly on a mass production line using heavy plastic snap tabs. They were meant to be permanently sealed. If you attempt to open the plastic shell of a standard Instamatic to fix a jammed shutter spring, the tabs will snap. There are no specialized repair forms dedicated to adjusting the shutter tension of a plastic Instamatic. There are no spare parts drawers in the back rooms of surviving camera stores. The physical site of this incredible manufacturing output has also been erased. The sprawling industrial complex in Rochester, New York, once known as Kodak Park, where tens of thousands of workers stamped the plastic bodies, molded the asymmetrical cartridges, and coated miles of Kodacolor emulsion, has been radically downsized. Renamed Eastman Business Park, dozens of its massive, specialized manufacturing buildings were systematically imploded and bulldozed in the 2000s to reduce the company's tax burden as the film market collapsed. The physical footprint of the Instamatic empire is now, in many places, empty grass and repurposed industrial space. Yet, there is a surprise footnote to the death of the 126 format. In recent years, a small, highly dedicated community of analog experimenters has refused to let the Instamatic die completely. Using 3D printers, they have designed and manufactured specialized plastic adapters, often nicknamed Phacmatics. These hollow, 3D printed cartridges allow a modern user to manually spool standard 35mm film into the physical shape of a 126 cassette. The user must tape over the camera's sensor window, shoot in the dark to avoid light leaks, and manually extract the film in a changing bag. They do not go through this tedious, highly inconvenient process to achieve optical perfection. The plastic lens is still soft. The exposure is still fixed. They do it simply to hear the hollow plastic click of the shutter one more time. They do it to prove that the machine can still divide light. But the true legacy of the Kodak Instamatic is not found in a 3D printed adapter, and it is not the physical machine itself. This is not nostalgia. It is the physical archive of the American 20th century. Go into almost any home in the United States, open the heavy cardboard shoeboxes stored in the back of the hall closet, and pull out the faded, square, 3.5-inch paper prints from the late 1960s and 1970s. Look at the slightly soft edges. Look at the harsh, direct shadow cast by the Sylvania flash cube against the wood-paneled wall. Look at the vibrant, slowly fading chemical dyes of the Kodacolor emulsion. The cameras may be dead plastic, but the negatives they produced are the foundational documents of millions of families. The Instamatic did exactly what it was engineered to do. It removed the mechanical barrier between the amateur and the image, ensuring that an entire generation was documented not by expensive professionals in formal studios, but by the ordinary, untrained people who actually lived the moments. It was a frictionless agreement between a company and a family. When the friction returned, the camera died. In a dusty antique mall in Ohio, a plastic Instamatic 104 sits in a glass case, its chrome-painted plastic peeling, its viewfinder clouded with decades of dust, its empty film chamber hollow. The advance lever permanently locked, unable to divide light ever again. See you in the next one.